The night had already decided to be long before anyone stepped into it, and the land bore that knowledge without signaling it to those who would pass across it. Open range stretched outward from the low hills, grass pressed flat in places by old grazing patterns, rising again where wind had learned its way through. A creek cut a shallow line through the dark, its water moving steadily, but without sound enough to be followed, carrying reflections that broke apart as soon as they formed. Fence posts stood at uneven intervals, some upright, others leaning as if tired of holding their place, wire humming faintly when the air shifted. The sky settled low and heavy, clouds stacked thick enough to dull the stars, leaving only small breaks where light slipped through briefly and vanished again. Wind moved across the ground in passes, while lifting dust in narrow sheets, then laying it back down, rearranging the surface without leaving clear evidence. The smell of sage and dry earth mixed with the faint trace of old smoke, the kind that never fully leaves ground where fires had once burned and been forgotten. Sound behaved differently at night there, traveling farther than expected in some directions and disappearing entirely in others, as if the land chose what to carry and what to keep. A horse shifting weight a mile off could be heard clearly, while nearer movements dissolved into nothing. The range did not offer guidance. It did not narrow paths or brighten landmarks. It held itself open and indistinct, making distance difficult to judge and time harder still. Hours lengthened without markers. Darkness gathered in pockets along shallow draws and behind rock outcroppings, while leaving other stretches exposed and pale, neither hidden nor revealed. The creek banks held the day's warmth longer than the open ground, then cooled all at once, releasing a dampness that settled low and clung to boots and hems. Somewhere, insects resumed their work briefly, then stopped, unsettled by a shift they could not measure. The land had known nights like this before, nights when men moved carefully and others waited without knowing why. It remembered the weight of stillness more clearly than it remembered motion. Tracks made earlier blurred, as dust drifted back over them, softening edges until direction became suggestion, rather than fact. The range accepted this without comment. It did not preserve intention. It preserved passage only long enough to be crossed. Time moved unevenly, she stretching where nothing happened, and compressing where it did, though no one present could have said when either occurred. Clouds slid across what little light remained, making the dark thicker, then thinner, never steady enough to reassure. The wind fell away entirely for a span, leaving the air heavy and close, then returned from another direction, cooler, carrying no message with it. Even the creek altered its sound, quieting, then resuming as if testing whether it would be noticed. The land did not concern itself with choices, but it was familiar with their aftermath. It had absorbed hesitation before, watched it settle into soil alongside certainty and regret alike. Long nights did not trouble it. They belonged to it. By the time the hours reached their slowest point, when fatigue made edges soften and judgment thin, the range held everything evenly. The ground ready to take weight, the dark ready to keep it. The distance wide enough that nothing felt immediate. The land remained as it always did when people faced decisions meant to be carried alone. It stayed open. It stayed quiet. It waited, already prepared to remember whatever crossed it before dawn without asking why. He was known along that stretch of range by routine, rather than reputation. A man whose presence fit easily into the work that needed doing, and no further. The cowboy moved with the practiced economy of someone who had learned early that excess motion wasted strength. His shoulders set, his pace steady, his attention always angled slightly outward, as if listening for something that rarely announced itself. He worked cattle where the ground allowed it, rode fence when wire sagged or posts gave way, and took night turns without complaint when hands were short. Those who hired him would have said he was reliable, though they might have struggled to add anything beyond that. He did not talk much about where he had come from, and no one pressed him. The range had a way of smoothing people down until origin mattered less than endurance. His gear was serviceable rather than notable. Leather worn to softness, metal dulled by use. Nothing carried for show. When he dismounted, he did so carefully, not because of injury, but because he treated his body as something meant to last. He ate what was offered, slept where he was told, and rose before light without being called. In camp, he chose a place at the edge, close enough to be counted, far enough to avoid conversation that drifted without purpose. Others spoke around him, sometimes to him, but rarely about him. He answered questions directly and did not expand. If asked his opinion, he gave it plainly and let it stand without defense. There was no urgency in the way he occupied space. He did not hurry to fill silence, and so silence settled easily around him. The land seemed to accept this, allowing his passage without resistance. Horses calmed under his hand. Dogs watched him without barking. Even strangers read his presence correctly, sensing neither threat nor invitation. At night, when the work was done and the fire burned low, he sat with his back to a log or a rock, looking outward rather than into flame, as if the range held more worth watching than stories being told. He did not gamble. He did not boast. When others spoke of plans, he listened without adding to them, not from disinterest but from habit. He had learned that many plans did not survive daylight. Those who noticed him over time might have said he carried something unspoken, though they could not have named what it was. Not grief exactly, not anger. Something closer to restraint, practiced and maintained. He had seen enough of what happened when words moved faster than judgment, and he preferred to let events reveal themselves before deciding where to stand. In daylight, his shadow stayed close, falling where it should. At night, it stretched long and indistinct, blending into the ground until it was difficult to tell where he ended and the land began. He belonged to that ambiguity without remark. The range had made room for him the way it made room for many men like him, not by welcoming, but by not objecting. He filled a role that required presence more than explanation, and he filled it well. Those who worked beside him trusted that he would be where he was meant to be when needed, and nowhere more. If he carried a history beyond the immediate work, it did not surface in his movements or his speech. He let the land set the terms of his days, and in doing so, he remained readable without being known, a figure shaped by long habit and quiet attention, moving through the range as someone prepared to face whatever the night might place before him, even if it never did. The decision did not arrive as a sudden turn or a clear instruction, but as a narrowing of what had once felt open, the way night closes around a person without fully darkening all at once. He sensed it first in the land, in the way sound shifted and then failed to return, in how the range seemed to hold its breath without reason given. Earlier that evening, he had ridden farther out than planned, following a line of fence that needed checking. Though the wire could have waited until morning, he told himself this was routine, but routine had begun to feel like cover rather than reason. Somewhere beyond the low draw, movement had registered and then faded, not close enough to name, not far enough to dismiss. He reined in and listened, allowing time to stretch until impatience lost its edge. The choice formed there, between continuing on and turning back, between reporting what he could not fully confirm and carrying it alone until it shaped itself more clearly. He knew the men he rode with, knew how quickly uncertainty hardened into accusation once it was spoken aloud. A word, once released, would move faster than he could follow it. It would gather meaning as it went, leaving little room for correction. Silence, by contrast, would hold everything in place, but at a cost that could not yet be measured. He considered the terrain ahead, the creek crossing that narrowed passage, the open stretch beyond it, where cover thinned and movement showed plainly. He considered how the night favored those who waited and punished those who rushed. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the pause, ears turning back briefly before settling again. He laid a hand on the saddle horn and felt the leather warm from use, familiar, grounding. The decision asked for no speech. It did not require witness. It asked only that he accept responsibility for whatever followed, whether or not it could later be explained. He weighed the habit he had formed over years of work, the habit of finishing what was in front of him and leaving speculation to others. He weighed the quieter instinct that had kept him alive through nights less forgiving than this one, the instinct to let events reveal themselves fully before stepping into their path. Neither instinct offered assurance. Both carried risk. He thought of how often men spoke to be seen acting, and how rarely action taken quietly was understood for what it was. The range gave no guidance. Wind moved once across the grass, then fell away, leaving the air heavy and unchanged. He turned his horse slightly, not toward camp, not farther out, but into a line that allowed him to see without being seen, to remain present without announcing it. This was the shape the decision took. Not advance or retreat, but position. He would stay where he was, hold the ground that allowed passage to be observed, and speak only if what passed demanded it beyond doubt. The choice felt small in the body, almost ordinary, yet it carried a weight that settled into his shoulders and did not lift. He did not tell himself it was the right thing. He told himself only that it was the thing he could carry. As the hours moved on, he remained there, watching the dark thin and thicken, listening for changes that might never come. He allowed the night to work around him without interference, though trusting that intervention, if required, would announce itself clearly enough to leave no room for hesitation. Until then, he held his silence, not as avoidance, but as containment. The decision closed in on itself, quiet and complete, leaving no excess to explain later. When at last he shifted his weight and turned back toward camp, he did so without marking the moment, knowing that what mattered had already been settled in the stillness he would not later describe. Time did not move forward in a way that could be counted after that, but spread itself thin across the range, asking to be endured rather than measured. The night held him where he had chosen to remain, neither advancing nor retreating, and the land seemed to accept this arrangement without comment. Waiting took on texture. It lived in the way his muscles settled into stillness, then tightened again without warning, in the way his eyes adjusted to darkness until shadows felt solid, and solid things lost their edges. The horse beneath him shifted occasionally, careful not to break the quiet, its breathing steady, its patience practiced. Sound arrived out of order. A far-off movement carried clearly, while something closer failed to register at all. He learned not to trust distance. He learned to trust duration. The creek altered its tone several times, water striking stone differently as levels shifted, then returning to its earlier sound as if nothing had changed. Clouds moved across the broken starlight, making the dark alternately heavier and thin enough to see shapes without detail. Waiting asked him to remain present without expectation, to hold attention without deciding what it would be used for. He did not rehearse outcomes. He did not imagine explanations. Those would have required a future he was not yet certain would arrive cleanly. Instead, he attended to what was immediate, the faint pull of wind along the draw, the way dust settled back onto the ground after each brief lift, the slow cooling of metal beneath his hand. Waiting stripped intention down to function. He was there to observe, and not to act unless the shape of action became unavoidable. Hours stretched, compressing again when nothing occurred, expanding when the possibility of something almost did. Fatigue pressed at the edges of his attention, not sharply, but persistently, testing whether stillness could be mistaken for inattention. He countered it by shifting focus rather than posture, counting breaths once, then abandoning the count, listening for irregularity rather than sound itself. The range did not hurry him. It did not threaten. It simply continued, offering no signal that the waiting would end, or that it needed to. At some point, a movement passed through the far edge of his awareness, too indistinct to name, too brief to pursue. He did not follow it. Waiting had taught him that not every disturbance asked to be answered. Another hour passed, nor perhaps two. The night deepened, then thinned slightly, suggesting the approach of its longest stretch. Cold settled in with more insistence, reaching through clothing and into joints, making each breath feel heavier than the last. He welcomed this discomfort. It kept him anchored. Waiting without discomfort risked turning into abstraction. This did not. The land revealed its patience fully then, holding him in place without promise of release. He understood that whatever outcome followed would not arrive dramatically. It would come as a change so slight it might be missed by anyone not already attuned to it. That was the nature of waiting. It did not prepare a person for resolution. It prepared a person to live with what unfolded slowly, without announcement. As the night wore on, he accepted that the waiting itself was part of what he would carry forward, regardless of what did or did not occur. It had already shaped him, pressing his choice deeper into habit. When the dark finally began to loosen its hold, just enough to suggest morning was possible, he did not feel relief. Waiting had not promised that. It had only confirmed that time would pass whether or not anything changed, and that his decision would remain intact across that passing, untested by event, sustained by endurance alone. What followed did not arrive as confirmation or disaster, but as a shift so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not already carrying the night inside them. By morning, the range looked much as it always did. Grass pressed and rising again, dust settling where hooves had crossed, the creek returning to a sound that suggested nothing unusual. Camp stirred slowly. Men spoke of ordinary matters, of work left undone, of weather turning. No one asked him where he had been during the longest hours of the night, and he did not offer it. The absence of question settled heavier than inquiry would have. Later, fragments of information moved through the hands in uneven ways. Someone mentioned finding tracks farther out than expected, blurred enough to raise doubt, but clear enough to be remarked upon. Another spoke of movement near the creek that had come to nothing. These observations were exchanged without urgency, shaped by the understanding that nothing now required response. The consequence of his decision was not consequence in the way men usually meant it. Nothing had been stopped. Nothing had been allowed to worsen in a way that could be proven. Instead, a boundary had been drawn quietly, one that only he seemed aware of. He carried the knowledge that had something unfolded differently. Words might have been required, and those words would have set events into motion beyond recall. That knowledge did not ease with daylight. It sharpened. In the days that followed, work continued as before, yet he noticed small recalibrations. He was relied upon in the same ways, but not asked for interpretation. The tasks came with assumptions rather than discussion. His silence during the night had trained others, without their knowing it, to expect the same restraint from him again. This was not trust exactly. It was a narrowing of expectation. He had proven himself a man who would hold rather than interrupt, contain rather than declare. That reputation settled without ceremony. When a disagreement arose between others weeks later, he was present but not consulted, his presence taken as stabilizing without requiring contribution. The cost of the night revealed itself there. His choice had not altered the outcome of any single event, but it had altered how he was placed within events that followed. Silence had become part of his function. The land reflected this quietly. Paths he rode wore deeper where he slowed, the less where he might once have pressed on. The range did not ask what he had prevented or permitted. It only absorbed the pattern of his movement, as it had absorbed countless others. On rare occasions, when night work placed him again near the edge of things. He felt the old tightening return, not as fear, but as awareness of what his restraint now signaled. Speaking later would have required undoing the position his silence had secured. He understood then that consequence was not punishment or reward. It was placement. He had placed himself among those who carry uncertainty without distributing it. That carried value, but it also carried distance. Others could move quickly because someone like him remained still. That was not a role assigned openly. It emerged from the night itself. He accepted it without naming it, and the way he accepted weather that did not favor him. If regret existed, it did not take the form of wishing he had spoken. It took the form of knowing that speaking would no longer be expected of him, even when it might have mattered. His decision had reduced the number of moments in which his voice would be sought. It had preserved calm at the cost of articulation. The range, indifferent, continued to hold his steps, pressing them into soil that would soon look no different from any other. Yet the consequence remained, carried forward in habit and assumption, a quiet narrowing of place that could not be traced back to that night by anyone who had not been there to feel it settle. Years later, when that night had lost its edges and been folded into the long run of seasons that followed, the decision remained present without being spoken of, carried more by habit than by recollection. Men who had ridden with him remembered him as steady, as someone who could be counted on to be where he needed to be, though they could not have said when that certainty had been earned. They did not recall a moment when he proved it. They remembered only that he had always been that way. The range remembered more, though it kept its knowing without preference. Grass grew and was pressed down again. Fences were mended, then leaned, then were mended once more. The creek shifted its course slightly over years of runoff, changing the sound of water where it met stone. On nights when work kept him out late, the others noticed that he chose positions that allowed him to see without being seen, that he waited rather than advanced, that he spoke only when a thing had already made itself unavoidable. They took this as temperament, not as consequence. Stories, when they were told at all, did not mention decisions. They mentioned endurance. They mentioned a man who did not trouble the night with unnecessary movement. Younger hands learned from watching him rather than from instruction, absorbing his restraint as part of the work itself. If they asked why he did not speak more, he answered with practical reasons, never with memory. Over time, the night in question lost its singularity. It became one of many long nights that defined range work without being distinguished from the rest. Yet, the choice made, there continued to shape how events were carried forward. When trouble later brushed close to the edges of camp, men waited longer before reacting, trusting that if intervention were needed, it would become clear. That trust was not spoken. It existed as a pause, a shared stillness that echoed the one he had held years before. The land held this rhythm easily. It had always known waiting as a form of movement. As he aged, his work narrowed, but his habits did not. He rode less distance, but he watched more carefully. Those who replaced him did not know what they were inheriting, only that a way of doing things had been set before them. Near the end of his working years, someone once asked if there had been a time when he wished he had acted differently. He considered the question without urgency, but then answered that wishing did not change what had already been carried. The reply ended the matter. After he left the range, the space he had occupied filled slowly, not with another man like him, but with several who together approximated what he had done alone. The land adjusted without ceremony. His tracks faded, as all tracks do, pressed flat by weather and use. What remained was not a story of action or silence, but of placement, of how one decision, made without witness, had settled into the pattern of work and waiting that followed. People did not speak of it because they did not know how. They spoke instead of the way nights felt along that stretch of ground, of how time seemed to lengthen there, of how some men learned to listen before moving. This was how the decision endured, not as an event, but as a way of being remembered without detail. The night itself did not ask to be named. It did not require explanation. It had been carried forward in posture, in pause, in the unremarked passing of hours held steady by someone who understood that some choices complete themselves only when they are allowed to remain unspoken. This is how it was remembered.